Welcome back to another exciting video. Today we will be looking at the worst serial killers that ever lived. These guys were most certainly the most dangerous. If you enjoy these videos, please do hit that subscribe and like button. And if you want to be notified whenever I upload new video, then be sure to hit the bell. Have you ever wondered why people become serial killers, or if becoming a serial killer is a genetic thing? Well then, you are not alone. Online psychology degree guide states that there are traits that are commonly found amongst serial killers. These traits are as follow. There are biological, social, and psychological underpinnings of this behavior. People that become serial killers are often intrinsically motivated by reasons they consider to be important. Serial killers occur amongst a variety of demographic groups, including people of different races, genders, ages, and religions. Serial killers who are motivated by sex typically begin to sexualize violence during childhood development. Although these traits are common, they also state that there is no blueprint that makes a serial killer, and because of this fact, psychologists is fascinated by studying the behavior and traits of serial killers to figure out what makes them the way they are. I did some research into who are the worst serial killers and compiled a list. Please take note that they are in no particular order. So without further ado, let's jump in, shall we? 1. Ted Bundy. He is included on this list because of the pure brutality he used on his victims. Ted Bundy, born Theodore Robert Bundy, was a serial killer during the 70s. He operated as a serial killer from 1974 to 1978. The true count of his victims during these 4 years are believed to be much higher, even though Ted admitted to 30 murders during those 4 years. Ted would approach his victims in public places by sometimes impersonating an authority figure. After taking them, he would take them to unknown places. After bludgeoning them at these locations, his victims would be strangled and raped. It is believed that he would often revisit his victims' bodies for grooming and to have sexual acts with his victims' bodies until the bodies would start to decompose. It was found that Ted decapitated 12 of his victims, keeping their heads as a trophy. In 1975, he was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, he engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before his ultimate recapture in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences in 2 trials. Bundy was executed at Florida State Prison in Woodford on January 24, 1989. 2. Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei is on the list for his brutality and the amount of murders committed. Andrei operated as a serial killer from 1978 to 1990. He was finally convicted in 1992 after admitting to 56 murders. During his time, he was nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, the Rostov Ripper, and the Red Ripper. Andrei would lure his victims by having polite and innocent conversations with them, after he would often rape them while slashing them to death. He later stated that he was able to achieve sexual arousal and orgasm only through stabbing and slashing women and children to death, and he later claimed that the urge to relive the experience had overwhelmed him. Nonetheless, Chikatilo did stress that, initially, he had struggled to resist these urges, often cutting short business trips to return home rather than face the temptation to search for a victim. His victims were women and children. In 1994, Andrei was finally executed by a gunshot. 3. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey was included due to the acts that followed after he killed. Jeffrey operated as a serial killer from 1978 to 1991. He was a serial killer and sex offender who committed the murder and dismemberment of 17 men and boys. During his time, he was nicknamed Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster because he would later perform cannibalistic acts on the bodies. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and a psychotic disorder, Dahmer was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 15 of the 16 murders he had committed in Wisconsin and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment. Dahmer was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for an additional homicide committed in Ohio in 1978. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. 4. John Wayne Gacy. John is on the list due to his brutality. John operated as a serial killer from 1972 to 1978. John was serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. John regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, personas he had devised. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public services as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. He committed all of his murders inside his ranch-style house near Norridge, a village in Norwood Park Township in suburban Chicago. Typically, he would lure a victim to his home and dupe him into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. He would then rape and torture his captive before killing him by either suffocating or strangling them with a wire or cord. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. 4 were discarded in the Des Plaines River. John was convicted of the sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa, in 1968 and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972, had murdered twice more by the end of 1975, and murdered at least 30 subsequent victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Des Plaines teenager Robert Bist led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. In 1980 he was sentenced to death, on death row at Menard Correctional Center. He spent much of his time painting. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. 5. Richard Ramirez. Richard was included due to his skills he used. Richard Ramirez, dubbed Night Stalker, Valley Intruder, as his attacks were first clustered in the San Gabriel Valley, and Walk-In Killer was an American serial killer whose crime spree took place in California between June 1984 and August 1985. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1989. He died in 2013 while awaiting execution. Ramirez's childhood is considered an influence on his crimes. Abused by his father, Ramirez began developing gruesome, macabre interests in his early and mid-teens from his older cousin, Miguel or Mike Ramirez, who allegedly also taught him some of the military skills that he would go on to use during his year-long killing spree. Ramirez also cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult. By the time he had left his home in Texas and moved to California at the age of 22, he had begun frequently using cocaine. Ramirez would often commit burglaries to support his drug addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by murders, attempted murders, rapes, and assaults. Ramirez's highly publicized home invasion and murder spree terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. However, his first known murder occurred as early as April 1984. This crime was not connected to Ramirez, nor was it known to be his doing, until 2009. Ramirez used a wide variety of weapons and different murder methods, including handguns, various types of knives, a machete, a tire iron, and a claw hammer. He punched, pistol whipped, and strangled many of his victims, both with his hands and in one instance a ligature, stomped at least one victim to death in her sleep, and tortured another victim by shocking her with a live electrical cord. Ramirez also enjoyed frequently degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided not to kill, by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan, or telling them to swear on Satan if there were no more valuables left in their homes he had broken into and burglarized. In 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The judge who upheld Ramirez's 19 death sentences remarked that his deeds exhibited cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. Ramirez never expressed any remorse for his crimes. He died on June 7, 2013, of complications from B-cell lymphoma while awaiting execution on California's death row. 6. Pedro López, included for the sheer amount of his victims. Pedro is a Colombian serial killer and child rapist who murdered a minimum of 110 young girls from 1969 to 1980 and claimed to have murdered over 300 victims across Colombia, Peru and Ecuador. Released from a Colombian mental facility in 1998, his whereabouts are currently unknown. Aside from uncited local accounts, his crimes first received international attention from an interview conducted by Ron Leitner, a longtime freelance photojournalist who reported interviewing López in his Ambato prison cell in 1992. According to Leitner's story, López became known as the Monster of the Andes in 1980, when he purportedly led police to 53 graves in Ecuador of girls between 9 and 12 years of age. Leitner also claims that in 1983, López was found guilty of the murder of 110 girls in Ecuador and confessed to an additional 240 murders in Peru and Colombia. He is also seen as the world's most successful serial killer. 7. Belle Gunness, included on the list because of her gruesomeness. Belle, the only female on our list and nicknamed Hell's Belle, was a Norwegian-American serial killer who was active in Illinois and Indiana between 1884 and 1908. Gunness is thought to have killed at least 14 people, most of whom were men she enticed to visit her rural Indiana property on the promise of marriage, while some sources speculate her involvement in as many as 40 murders. Gunness seemingly died in a fire in 1908, but it is popularly believed that she faked her death. Her actual fate is unconfirmed. 8. Angel Resendiz, included for his body count. Angel Resendiz, also known as the Railroad Killer, was a Mexican itinerant serial killer suspected in as many as 23 murders across the United States and Mexico during the 1990s. Some also involved sexual assault. He had become known as the Railroad Killer as most of his crimes were committed near railroads where he had jumped off the trains which he was using to travel around the country. On June 21, 1999, he briefly became the 457th fugitive listed by the FBI on its 10 most wanted fugitives list before surrendering to the Texas authorities on July 13, 1999. He was convicted of capital murder in Texas and executed by lethal injection in 2006. 9. Richard Chase, included for his brutality. Richard Chase was an American serial killer, cannibal, and necrophile who killed 6 people in the span of a month in 1977 and 1978 in Sacramento, California. He was nicknamed the Vampire of Sacramento because he drank his victims' blood and cannibalized their remains. In 1979, Chase stood trial on 6 counts of murder. In order to avoid the death penalty, the defense tried to have him found guilty of second-degree murder, which would result in a life sentence. Their case hinged on Chase's history of mental illness and the suggestion that his crimes were not premeditated. On May 8, 1979, the jury found Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and, rejecting the argument that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, sentenced him to die in the gas chamber. His fellow inmates, aware of the extremely violent and grisly nature of Chase's crimes, feared him and, according to prison officials, often tried to persuade Chase to commit suicide. 10. The Zodiac Killer, included due to its mysterious nature. The Zodiac Killer is the nickname of an unidentified serial killer who operated in Northern California in the late 1960s. The case has been described as the most famous unsolved murder case in American history, becoming a fixture of popular culture and inspiring amateur detectives to attempt to resolve it. The Zodiac murdered 5 known victims in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969, operating in rural, urban and suburban settings. He targeted young couples and a lone male cab driver, and his known attacks took place in Benicia, Vallow, unincorporated Napa County, and the city of San Francisco proper. 2 of his attempted victims survived. The Zodiac himself claimed to have murdered 37 victims, and he has been linked to several other cold cases, some in Southern California or outside the state. The Zodiac originated the name himself in a series of taunting letters and cards that he mailed to regional newspapers, threatening killing sprees and bombings if they were not printed. Some of the letters included cryptograms, or ciphers, in which the killer claimed that he was collecting his victims as slaves for the afterlife. Of the 4 ciphers he produced, 2 remain unsolved. and one was cracked only in 2020. While many theories regarding the identity of the killer have been suggested, the only suspect authorities ever publicly named was Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender who died in 1992. Although the Zodiac ceased written communications around 1974, the unusual nature of the case led to international interest that has sustained throughout the years. The San Francisco Police Department marked the case inactive in April 2004, but reopened it at some point prior to March 2007. The case also remains open in the city of Vallejo, as well as in Napa County and Solano County. The California Department of Justice has maintained an open case file on the Zodiac murders since 1969. And that's a wrap on today's video. If you liked the content, then don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button. Get notified every time I upload new content by hitting the bell. If you have any suggestions on videos you would like to see, please drop them in the comments. Well, that's it from me today. Until next time.